is on. Yes, good. Thank you for having us here. My inclination when I talk before an audience is to welcome the audience to some place, but it's like, this is your place, and we're just dropping in and hoping we can provide you with a little entertainment this evening. As Mo just said, Dani and I have been married for 17 years, and I've never actually interviewed her about anything.
That's why I'm sitting in between them.
And I'm very...
So they can hold hands.
Exactly. But I can hold hands with Nick, who I'm also very, very fond of. So... and Nick and Dani have an awful lot in common with their work. They both, although they do many other things, both of them have written memoirs that have gotten a lot of attention. And not only do they both write memoirs, they have both written a lot about writing memoirs. So they've given that an awful lot of thought. And so just to start it off, I want to read... and I have it on my iPhone because it was online. I want to read something that Dani published in Salon magazine, a few weeks ago. And then I want to read something of Nick's, and then hopefully the two of them can go off and have a discussion, and you won't have to look at me. And this was a piece that Dani published in Salon. And the title of which was Dear Disillusioned Reader Who Contacted Me on Facebook. I'm sorry that the facts of my life, as outlined by Google, did not line up in perfect synchronicity with the narrative of my memoir. I apologize, too, for not including what you insist is salient personal information to which you feel entitled. There's some attitude in this. I'm sorrier still that this prompted you to compare me to James Fry. This is going to be a leitmotif, so just keep it. James Fry, who wrote fiction and called it memoir, which is something else entirely. That fellow who pretended to have a love affair at Buchenwald, that young woman who lied about having been part of a Los Angeles girl gang, these are writers who had fictional impulses, and for reasons I can only think of as pathological, chose to break the sacred pact between writer and reader. And what is the sacred pact, you ask, dear disillusioned reader? What, when clearly I have broken my side, do you consider to be yours? Let me begin by sharing with you what this sacred pact is not. When a writer sits down to write memoir, she is not sharing her diary. She is not confessing. She is not doing some sort of public striptease. Her whole entire life is not up for grabs. So that's Dani. And then this is from Nick's book, The Reenactments. And he writes about this when he's going back with Chris Weitz, right? Paul Weitz, sorry. Chris is his brother. That's knowing too much. To the director of Being Flynn, to his father's apartment before making the movie. Part of this visit, I know, is to make sure I didn't just make it all up, that my father actually lived on the streets, that he didn't just have one drink too many one night, like James Fry, or like that white girl, Margaret Seltzer, who wrote in the book about being raised by the Crips and even hired a black woman to sit in her living room when the New York Times came to visit, to play the part of Big Mom, her fake foster mother. So James Fry and these other things have really put a lot of scrutiny on memoirists in terms of making you wonder what's true, what isn't true, and putting pressure on you to almost prove that what you're saying is the truth. So I'm going to just... Oh, wait a minute.
Are we going to begin by reading?
You are going to begin by reading.
Yeah. Thanks, honey.
Yes. But before that... Nick is going to read a little bit, and then Dani's going to read a bit, and then we'll get into that discussion.
So yeah, think about truth and
Yeah, while I read. Hi, we're each going to read just briefly, and then we'll get back to our conversation. It's really been a pleasure to be here, a real great pleasure to be here in Aspen, where I've never been, and it was quite an intense week with the loss from the community, which it was palpable in the community all the days I was here. So I'm going to read a little bit from, I'm going to read basically a few passages about my father from different places that I wrote about him. So it's nice that Michael introduced it with that little thing of going to meet him with the director of the film. But this is from the first book that the film was based on. This is from Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. It's called Ham. Noah had grandiose plans to save the world. Noah, it should be remembered, was a disreputable man who heard a voice. The villagers, his neighbors, laughed. Noah, a bit of a drunk, was not taken seriously. The voice said, "By what you make, you will save the world." And so, reluctantly at first, Noah began his life's work, an impossible project, something much larger than himself. But at night, Noah was again filled with doubt, and he drank to quiet the voices. The people in his village spoke behind their hands as he passed, touched their caps, smiled. The village was miles from the ocean, and Noah was spending his days building a boat. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham came upon his father one day, naked and ranting, building his impossible boat in a blackout. God had spoken, God kept speaking, God wouldn't stop speaking. For witnessing his father naked and drunk, Ham and all his offspring became accursed forever to the end of time. My father may not hear voices, but he also has an impossible project. He's also filled with a force larger than himself. In nearly every letter my father has sent me for the last 25 years, he tells me his writing is going very, very well. His novel, such as it is, if it is at all, written in blackout in prison, is his arc, the thing that will save him, that will save the world. His single-mindedness impresses most, his fathomless belief in his own greatness, in his powers to transform a failed world, to make it whole again by a word, by a story. That if you stick with your vision long enough, you will be redeemed. All of this in the face of near constant evidence to the contrary. The actual circumstances of his life, his alcoholism, the crimes he's committed, his homelessness, and decades of poverty, these are mere tests, and what is a faith not tested? Noah needed to gather nails, to sort the animals, to convince his sons. He planed his timber and laid out the ribs. His ark would be bigger than the temple. We all need to create the story that will make sense of our lives, to make sense of the daily tasks. Yet each night the doubts returned, howling through him. Without doubt, there can be no faith. At daybreak, Noah looked to the darkening sky and vowed to work faster. My father cannot die, he tells me, will not, until his work is completed. But is there a deadline inside him for when he must finish? A day, like Noah, when the rains begin. When the boat, finished or not, begins to rise from the cradle. So that was the first book. Now I'd like to read something from the reenactments. This was written about 10 years later. This is when, is this one? Yeah, it's this one. This is again, I think it's all in here. I don't think I have to say this as anything. I think I write it, so I don't have to say it. So this was several years later. My father got into he got off the streets. He was homeless for 5 years. He got off the streets into a subsidized housing for about 16 years, and then near the end of his life, we had to move him into a long-term care facility called Roscommon. So this is in Roscommon. It is impossible to know what shape we will find my father in. I worry he will be lost, incoherent. Yet when we show up at Roscommon, he's awake, in the lunchroom, and lucid. The television is on, each seat taken. It's a grim place, though the shelter will be grimmer. My father's apartment, by the time I moved him out, was grimmer. Here he has 3 meals a day, he has nurses and orderlies he is taken care of, which is perhaps all he ever desired, aside from fame. And now I am introducing him to Robert De Niro, who will play him in the film version of his life. We move to an empty room. I usually bring a copy of the memoir with me, as it seems to jog his memory, to hold it in his hands, to scan the pages that talk about his childhood, his nights in the shelter, his time in prison. But I realize I forgot to bring it. I know him so well after writing the book, and yet I barely know him at all. I get to the edge of knowing, then teeter back and forth. That's what makes these visits shimmer. It's all we can do, all I've ever done, stand before what I know and pulse into the unknown. For years, I could not imagine what my father would be like outside of alcohol, yet here he is. He hasn't had a drink since he's been inside Roscommon. His stories are different now, not as scripted, yet in many ways the damage is done. My father is 80. From the life he's led, it's a miracle he's still alive. I'd have died 100 deaths by now if I'd continued to drink like he drank. I forgot to bring my book, but it turns out De Niro has a copy. He pulls it out of his bag, dog-eared, heavily underlined, notes written in the margins. This is Robert De Niro, I tell my father, the actor who will play you in the film we are making about your life. My father nods, doesn't seem impressed. And this is Paul, the director, who also wrote the script. Very nice to meet you both, my father says, though he has, over the years, met Paul a few times before. I show him the book, remind him that it's about him, about his life. I point to my name on the cover. He is, as always, impressed. A book? How'd you figure that out? What promoted you? I point to the title, remind him that it's something he said, that he was always good with titles, which allows him to begin, to start talking about himself. It's like turning the handle on a jack-in-the-box, and out come his stories. Amazing that the stories are still inside him, that he can still find them. He holds forth for an hour. One tangent leads to another. When I try to bring him back around to the film we're making, he cuts me off. Let me speak, you wanton fucking goonball. We all smile. Paul writes wanton fucking goonball in his notebook. I take this moment to try once again to get him to take it in, that we're making a film about his life. Bob is going to play you in the movie version of this book. That's why we're here. He wanted to meet you. He looks over at De Niro, as if taking him in for the first time. So, you do a little acting, my father asks. You like to act? De Niro smiles, shrugs. Yeah, I do a little acting. I'd just like to finish with this poem that I wrote that was just recently in the New Yorker. I don't know why I say that, but it was. Because I'd never had a poem in the New Yorker before. and I wrote this poem, and I knew, as I was writing, I said, the New Yorker will publish this. It's called The Day Lou Reed Died. The Day Lou Reed Died, which is the same day my father died. It's not like his songs are going to simply evaporate, but since the news, I can't stop listening to him on endless shuffle. Familiar, yes. Inside me, yes. Which means I'm alive, or was, depending on when you read this. Now a song called Sad Song, the last one on Berlin, sung now from the other side. Just talk, really, at the beginning, then the promise or threat. I'm going to stop wasting my time. But what else are we made of, especially now? A chorus sings, sad song, sad song, sad song, sad song. I knew him better than I knew my own father, which means through these songs, which means not at all. They died on the same day. Oh, what a perfect day. Maybe at the same moments. Maybe both their bodies are laid out now in the freezer. Maybe side by side, maybe holding hands, waiting for the fire or the earth or the man or the salt. If I could, I'd let birds devour whatever's left and carry them into the sky. But all I can do, it seems, is lie on the couch and shiver, pull a coat over my body as if it were all I had, as if I were the one sleeping outside, as if it were my body something was leaving, rising up from inside me, and the coat could hold it in a little longer. Thank you.
Good evening. It's such a privilege and a pleasure and an honor to be here in Aspen, where I actually had this memory coming into this area right here of having been here as a little girl with my parents in the summer for the music festival. Just came back to me. But anyway, thank you so much for having me, for having us. I also want to say something very brief about Stuart, because there's been such a feeling of being haunted. I spoke to him at length. He interviewed me on the Thursday before he died, and I never met him, but there was a really lovely and really a sense of a real human being on the other end of the phone, and I've just been very aware of the presence of his loss in this community. So I'd like to dedicate this little reading to him. So I'm going to read two brief pieces from Still Writing, and the first one is called Smith Corona. Behind the closed door to her office, my mother typed. Most nights I fell asleep to the thunderous clacking of the keys on her Smith Corona, the high, thin ding of the carriage as she pushed the return lever at the end of each line. In her office, which shared a wall with my bedroom, she sat behind a big wooden desk piled with papers and boxes. She made carbon copies of everything she wrote. Not an inch of the surface of the desk was ever visible. If I close my eyes now, I can hear her. She was a very fast typist with long, strong fingers. The steady rhythm, ticka, 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 ding, ticka, 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 ding, was my childhood lullaby. In the sound of those keys, I heard frustration, anger, longing, determination, regret. My mother was always starting things she didn't finish. Some of her ideas had nothing to do with writing, most notably a line of jewelry for which she manufactured a prototype of a 24-karat gold tennis ball pendant with a sapphire in its center, the motto being, "Keep your eye on the ball." But her greatest efforts went into writing projects. One was a children's book called Yes, Marianne, the World is Round, a story about a girl whose dolls spring to life and tell her all about the countries they come from, for which my mother hired a famous children's photographer and used me as a model. I still have the manuscript for this book, the photographs encased in plastic sleeves, me as a 5-year-old in a yellow flannel Lance nightgown holding my dolls. My mother attempted most genres: children's books, poems, essays, journalism, and writing for TV, big screen, and stage. She wrote spec scripts for the Partridge Family and Hawaii Five-0, and sent them in manila envelopes to the offices of the Hollywood producers whose names were listed in the show's credits. She didn't know that submitting scripts in this manner was about as effective as making them into paper airplanes and flying them out the window. She had a strange, strained combination of cluelessness and desire. She flitted from project to project, never seeing anything through to the end. I was highly attuned to my mother. I felt and sensed her moods the way an animal can feel thunder and lightning miles away. She was my first lesson in character and point of view. I watched her carefully. I always, always knew what she was thinking. The way she behaved and what she felt were often at odds. She might, for example, be dancing around the kitchen, singing in her wobbly soprano and conducting with a wooden spoon, but she was staving off some sort of darkness, a rejection, an insult, a slight. Her most impassioned work was epistolary, and her Smith Corona was her weapon. She wrote letters to the mayor, the rabbi, the President of the United States. The letters were full of emphasis, as made clear by whole paragraphs in capitals, rows of exclamation points, sentences underlined in red pen or yellow highlighter, or sometimes both. My mother was filled with what seemed to be a bottomless ire. She was fueled by self-righteous indignation, which was only made worse when the mayor, the rabbi, the President of the United States did not personally write back. Ticka, 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 ding. Ticka, 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 ding. A girl falls asleep each night to the song of a typewriter. A girl, once again I become a character in my own childhood, feels the unhappiness simmering beneath her mother's determination. The girl tries hard to please her mother. Many years later, when she's a grown woman, one of her aunts will turn to her and say, "Do you want to make your mother happy? Do you really, really want to make your mother happy?" "Oh, yes, she did." "Well, then move in with her," the aunt said. And back then, the girl believed that her very survival depended on being good and pretty and accommodating and all the things her mother wanted her to be. She had no way of knowing that it was a losing battle, that no matter what she did, she herself would someday be identified as the cause of her mother's misery. Eventually, she would be the recipient of long letters, carbon copies covered with red ink and yellow highlighter and rows of exclamation points. How dare you? Once I was a grown woman, a writer, a teacher of writing, this came to be one of my mother's favorite rants. How dare you? As I sit on my chaise, covered by the antique Tibetan blanket, my dog sleeping by my feet, the wind blowing hard outside my window, my small computer balanced on my lap, books and papers all around me, my mother gone, 8 years now, I can still hear her trembling voice as clearly as the clacking keys of her typewriter. I never asked her, what was it that I had dared? What was so terrible that I had dared to become? So that's my mother. There's so many similarities. It's like...
They should have got married.
Terrifying. All right, and then this is one brief piece from the very end of Still Writing, and it's called Still Writing, this piece. My friend Mark, a sculptor whose large-scale works in granite and marble have been commissioned by Stanford University and Penn State, whose pieces are in some of the most prominent art collections in the country, and who is a well-respected professor at the New York Academy of Art, pulled me aside at a dinner party. "Somebody just asked me if I was still doing my sculpture thing," he said. I laughed. "I'm serious," he said. "How was I supposed to respond? Are you still doing that brain surgery thing?" I thought of all the times that I've been asked if I'm still writing. I've been asked this by acquaintances and strangers, even by fans, readers of mine. Still writing? It always felt to me like a shameful thing that I was being asked this, that surely if I had written more books, won more awards, made more money, was better known, I wouldn't be dealing with this question. Still writing? Over the years, I've assumed there must be a point at which this would cease to be asked. After 2 books, 5, 7, after being interviewed on NPR, The Today Show, Oprah, for God's sake. Though I felt protective of my friend, it was a relief, ridiculous though it was, to hear that he had to deal with the same question, as if he might have outgrown it, changed course, gone into law, or opened a fish store instead. I've asked around and discovered that every artist and writer I know contends with a version of this question. It's asked of writers who are household names. It's asked of photographers whose work hangs in the Museum of Modern Art. It's asked of stage actors who have won Tonys, of poets whose work is regularly published in the finest journals. No one who spends her life creating things seems exempt from it. Still writing? Oh, and I'm pretty sure the person asking it means no harm. It's just an awkward stab at social chit-chat, but best to stick with the weather or the miseries of the college admission process or the deliciousness of the soup. Still writing? I usually nod and smile, then quickly change the subject, but here is what I would like to put down my fork and say. Yes, I am. I will write until the day I die, or until I am robbed of my capacity to reason. Even if my fingers were to clench and wither, even if I were to grow deaf or blind, even if I were unable to move a muscle in my body save for the blink of one eye, I would still write. Writing saved my life. Writing has been my window, flung wide open to this magnificent, chaotic existence, my way of interpreting everything within my grasp. Writing has extended that grasp by pushing me beyond comfort, beyond safety, beyond my self-perceived limits. It has softened my heart and hardened my intellect. It has been a privilege. It has whipped my ass. It has burned into me a valuable clarity. It has made me think about suffering, randomness, goodwill, luck, memory, responsibility, and kindness on a daily basis, whether I feel like it or not. It has insisted that I grow up, that I evolve. It has pushed me to get better, to be better. It is my disease and my cure. It has allowed me not only to withstand the losses in my life, but to alter those losses, to chip away at my own bewilderment until I find the pattern in it. Once in a great while, I look up at the sky and think that if my father were alive, maybe he would be proud of me. That if my mother were alive, I might have come up with the words to make her understand. That I am changing what I can. I am reaching a hand out to the dead and to the living and the not yet born. So yes, still writing.
You know, I think it occurred to me the same when it occurred to Dani when you were reading that both you, Dani and Nick, have parents who said they wanted to be writers, who spent time writing, and who, for whom it was a strange obsession. And so do you, I mean, I hadn't even planned on asking this question, but I mean, do you, either one of you or both of you, feel that there's anything in your decision to become a writer, in your genesis, that has its roots in that?
I was just sort of still resonating with your beautiful reading, and thinking about it. It sort of ties into Michael's question. Just at the end, we sort of talk about like writing to the dead, and to speak to the dead, and to what one can do with it. And I was thinking back to your earlier book, to Devotion, where just this sort of these questioning what it is to be alive and existence. And your question, Michael's question, is a big one. But I think it also is a question that I think both of us, and probably all of us in our art, wrestle with. Like, what do we get from our parents? What do we owe to them? What do we, are we trying to be like them? Are we trying to outdo them? Are we trying to make them love us? I mean, all those questions, I don't think there is any one answer. Or is it genetic? I remember I got, my father, I didn't grow up with my father, and I began getting letters from him, Xerox letters with many exclamation points. And also, by the way, Dani and I have both admitted that we started using a lot of exclamation points in our texts lately, so yeah, it's a little horrifying. Just to show that we're not upset about something, like hi, do this thing I want you to do.
It's better than a smiley face.
Yeah, better than a smiley face. But I started getting letters from my father when he was in federal prison, and then years later he told me that he sent me the letters because the stamps were free. So, and he would Xerox the letters and send them out to many other people, to famous people also, like your mom. But when I got the letters, the creepy thing about it was that the handwriting was exactly like my handwriting. And friends would come and they'd sort of maybe see a letter on my table or something, and it'd be like, why did you write a letter to yourself? Which, and maybe on some other plane, that's what was happening. I don't know. I don't understand, really.
Well, I was struck there was a moment in your reading where you describe forgetting the book and feeling like, you'd spent these years knowing your father cold on the page, and there's the man in front of you who you know not at all. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether there's something about how many writers really have had happy and easy childhoods, and go on to have the obsession, the need, the impulse to sit down every day and sort of bang their head against the page. There's something about, at least for me, an ongoing need to understand, an ongoing need to have some sort of dialogue, even though it's a one-way dialogue. But I feel like I know both of my parents now, or I feel I do, better than I did when they were living. And it's been a way, in very different ways, because I had a much closer, more loving, and perhaps idealized relationship with my father, and a much more difficult relationship with my mother. But in both cases, a feeling of getting to know them, and I'm not going to say honor them, because it's with my father it feels like honoring him. With my mother it feels like something else altogether. And so the question of what is that? What is that impulse? And is it genetic? I mean, did your father ever actually produce anything in the way of writing?
Well, he produced me.
Exactly.
But he did. He actually had, in his, when he was homeless, he would sell blood to pay for his storage unit, which was storing his manuscripts. That was how he sort of paid for the manuscripts that were, and then when they moved to his apartment, and I have all the manuscripts now. He has many manuscripts. None of them are maybe publishable without a great deal of editing, but there is, online on my website, I put like the first 30 pages of one of his books, and anyone is free to publish it, really. And to edit it and publish it. I will send the whole thing to you if you want.
But so is there this feeling, I know for me, after my mother died, I had an even harder time writing about her in any way, because it felt like I was getting to have the last word. And I think you and I share this to some degree. I felt like I was in, for many years, a battle to the death with my mother that she was absolutely going to win. The fact that I ended up on the planet and that she was gone is still baffling to me. I mean, like the natural order of things just completely sort of upended. And so when she was alive, I didn't have, I didn't feel, I had a lot of feelings. I didn't feel guilty. I tried to be protective of her in the ways that I could. But I also felt like I was writing for my life in some way. And then after she died, there was this idea that other people had that I would be much more liberated to write sort of without worrying about her feelings, and I found myself more worried about her feelings in a way because I felt like I was writing the only legacy that she was going to have.
It's so, but what you've done is quite amazing. The piece you read is really amazing. The one with the typewriter and the next to the room.
She wouldn't like it,
Well, I mean, you get to hear her voice. She gets to say, how dare you, and in it, and so she's given full voice. I think it's quite a. You would never, we'd probably never completely satisfy him. My father, being a writer, when my first book came out, he basically what he did, and for any book, he just basically took full credit for it. That it wouldn't exist if he didn't exist, which is true. That's just sort of a basic fact of biology, right? Like that that book wouldn't exist unless he existed. And then he would even take more credit than that. Which I didn't mind, actually. I did, because I'm not actually sure on some level. Like, I don't know. Like, you talk about it, too, in Devotion. And just, like, there's this intellectual process of knowing things. Then there's this deeper mystery and questioning about, like, how things get doomed. Because my books, all of them, have a lot of lines of my father's in them. Like, you having saying, how dare you? That's, like, that actually is, like, this sort of way of, like, sort of capturing them and putting them in the page and stuff.
Well, and maybe in some way they knew it. Like I'm remembering right now a moment, there was a Thanksgiving dinner at our apartment in New York that my mother attended, and there were 17 friends that we invited to the dinner so that my mother would be a little neutralized. And after the dinner, we lived on 92nd Street and she lived on 86th Street. And a friend walked her home, and then from the corner of 86 in Amsterdam to her door, where they said goodnight to her, she tripped and fell. So we're cleaning up the dishes, very relieved that this Thanksgiving has gone without a hitch, and we get a call from the emergency room of a hospital, and race up there, and my mother is lying on a stretcher, and she looks up at me and she says, "Is there blood on my Ungaro?" and then she looked at me again and she said, "You can't use that." And I think in some way she was aware of the fact that
it's such a great title.
Is there blood on my Ungaro? Yeah, I use it by telling the story.
Can I use it?
It's all yours.
But I'm always wondering though if there is it's some childhood need to get the parents' approval, to just say, you struggle with this. Look at me. I've done what you wanted to do. And the parental reaction in both cases seems to be almost a negating of that accomplishment in the child, which has to be painful at some level.
Well, it's the question of whether you're trying to get their approval or just trying to get them. So, Which I think it starts out. I mean, some way, it was very complicated writing Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, because I didn't know him when I started that book, and part of it, I didn't really want to write a book about him, and it wasn't, I actually went and, I talk about it in the book, I went to just ask him like 2 questions about, which I asked, I had this creepy project, I made this sort of short documentary film, I got a grant for it, and the proposal was that I would go and interview my mother's ex-boyfriends, and ask them just 2 questions, like how they met my mother and how they found out she died. And my father was one of these people. It's a very, even as I wrote the proposal, I knew it was so creepy that I knew I'd get the grant. So I got this grant to do this, and I went, and my father was just one of these people. That was, before I wrote, this is sort of what started Another Bullshit Night in Suck City. I just went and looked him up. He was now housed for 5 years, and he was in an apartment. He'd been still writing me crazy letters, and I went to sort of see him, and I didn't really know him. I just said, okay, I don't really want to know you. I just want to ask you these 2 questions for this documentary film I'm making. And he just refused to answer them. He just answered them in these really elaborate, Byzantine ways. And I have no idea how this connects to your question, if there was a question. But
well, I think that the whole idea of what the motivation is, I think is interesting. I mean, I'll often say to my students of memoir, revenge is a really bad reason to write a memoir, because and how do you know that you're feeling that you're writing from revenge as you're writing? If you're thinking to yourself, I can't wait for so and so to read this, then that's that is an absolute indication that revenge is on the agenda. And why is that a bad idea? Well, ethically and morally and just on a human level, it's a bad idea, and also it doesn't make for a good book. It just doesn't. You can feel it. It reeks on the page.
You're gonna be embarrassed about it, almost as soon as it comes out.
Exactly, because it's
coming. Because also your feelings toward that person will probably change.
Right. Because one of the things that memoir does also is that it does freeze a moment in time, right? Like when if you were to write Another Bullshit Night in Suck City today, would it be the same book?
Well, that's like one of those mind games.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I always think that I guess having written Slow Motion and then 10 years later Devotion, and now still writing, which is is sort of a hybrid, but it's partially memoir, that it would be a really interesting project for a writer to write the same memoir every 10 years over the course of a lifetime, because the nature of the relationship of the self to the story at the time the story is told has got to have some impact on the story itself. And one of the things I love so much about the reenactments is that you are probing so deeply into all the different, it's like the meta levels of, there's the book, and then there's the film of the book, and then there's the book about the film of the book, but that's not what it's about. It's about memory and then just the nature of memory, and you're trying to, that moment that you read where it's like, did I make this up? Did he really only, have a drink once in a while? I think that there's something maybe in all of us, but I think it really comes to the fore when you're struggling with trying to write something and get it right, whatever that means, on the page, that really you question. Every time I read that passage about my mother, I think, really? But yes, really. But it's that struggle.
The beauty of the passage you read, just to point, it's so layered. Like there's this beautiful description of the room, and then there's the typewriter comes in, and then there's this sort of strange moment where the keys are, representing these sort of abstract emotions like frustration and rage and things, which is sort of wonderfully unstable because we don't really know what the keys represent, but that's like sort of a wonderful way to get that in there. And then it goes into this, the book stuff, and then the strange that the narrator turns into the she does this, and it just sort of moves through these mental processes and consciousness really in a beautiful way that feels really real, really, which is probably all we can do.
I mean, do you think in writing memoir that in some way the memoirist has to turn himself or herself into a he or a she in some way, that if it's completely the I, then it's and I don't mean by fictionalizing it at all. I want to be really clear about that. But I mean, there's a way in which I feel like I have to go. It's pretty much a high wire act where I don't want to be in any way easy on myself. I don't think about readers or legions of readers when I'm writing, because if I did, I wouldn't write. I think because it would be so frightening, the idea of, it's not the revelation, it's the picking and choosing of exactly what belongs in the story and what doesn't belong in the story, but there's some way in which there has to be some distance and some perspective on the self. Otherwise, then you're right up against it, and then there's all those questions about resentment and anger. And there's a beautiful quote that I never know who to attribute to, so I'm just going to say it. I attributed it to Edward Albee for years, but I've never been able to find it attributed to him. And it's, in order to write from, he's talking about rage, but in order to write from rage, the writer has to distance himself and write from what Frank O'Hara called the memory of my feelings. Observed rage is incoherent. Observed rage can be coherent. But you could substitute any emotion for that. Emotion is incoherent, but observing it, which is the memoirist's job in some way, gives it the beginning of coherence. Did we answer your question?
Good enough. And that sort of brings us back around to where I started, but I think we also have to turn to the Q&A right now. So I'm in terms of the questions, if you've got any questions about memoir in general or parents or anything, we would love to take some questions. They're going to bring, microphones are going to be coming around, so please wait for a microphone before you ask a question, and there's one coming down here.
And if someone brings up James Fry, then we can bring it all like full circle.
Yes.
So the thing that strikes me about both of you is that you're very real. And it seems like that's the emphasis in your writing as well. And do you think that it's because you strive after that realness because you grew up in a world that isn't? Like Ralph Waldo Emerson said, it takes a great deal of courage to grow up and be who you really are. Is that the drive?
I love that question. I mean, I love that observation. I think it's become more and more and more important to me as I get older. I think some of the impulse to write, for me, has come from a fear of being misunderstood. Being misunderstood is one of the things I most dislike. And when I can craft something on the page that and spend as much time with it as I possibly can or need to get it as close to the authentic thing that I want to say, which I almost never feel I do when I'm speaking. When I can do that, then I think I am possibly moving away from this kind of house of secrets and the way that I was raised, where there was a lot of lack of clarity about what was true, what wasn't true, what was real, what wasn't real, and a lot of pretense.
Yeah, it is a great question. It sort of goes back to what Dani was saying earlier too, just about the character, crafting a character in a book. I mean, one of the things, we've both written in this sort of this genre, a bit in this genre, in this this memoir genre, and it's a very strange place to write in, because because you do create a character of yourself. There's a character of Nick Flynn in these books that's crafted, because for the simple fact that I cannot actually exist inside this book. And so I have to sort of create a persona, or present certain aspects, and those aspects of the self that go into that book have to sort of feed what the whole project of the book is. So sometimes if people read Another Bullshit Night in Sex City, the Nick Flynn in that book is younger. And he's sort of like blameless. He's kind of like a victim. Like things happen to him, and he just sort of gets buffeted along in some way, which is maybe true in some level. In the next book, The Ticking is the Bomb, the Nick Flynn in that book is full of agency, and he actually does some gnarly things. And he's not as likable. in that book. And I could have written a book about that same period of time where I was like, bodhisattva. But the book was about something that was really gnarly. And I wanted to sort of explore that part of myself in the book. So it's just interesting when you say like that we're very real. I think that I did a talk with James Fry. I want to bring it back to James Fry. I was asked to do a thing in New York with him, a talk with him, about a month before it all blew up for him. And so, but he was doing very well at that point, where he sold like couple million copies of his books, And this was it was already an Oprah book, and I had never heard of it really, but I read it, before the discussion we had. He clearly hadn't read mine or even heard of me. And so we had a discussion. I sort of said, my first question to him was, how did you come up with the character of James Fry in your book? How did you just choose that character, that persona for your book? And he looked like, and he just looked at me and he said, well, that's not a character, that's me in the book. And I said, well, no, James, and it was a public forum like this, and I said, well, the character, if I had asked the question of the character in the book, that character, that James Fry would have punched me. Because that James Fry is very inarticulate, and he doesn't speak in complete sentences, and he just punches people. And you haven't punched me yet. And so, unless you're going to punch me, this is a character in the book. And he was really upset about this, and then a month later it turned out that it was a character. But it was just really clear by reading the book that this is, and the reason it was clear is because the character of James Fry in that book was consistent through the whole book. It was one character that he didn't change. He sort of stayed at the same tempo through the whole book. Whereas in life, if we write a different memoir, it's like your question about if you wrote a different memoir. Every time you look at yourself, it changes. I have it's just like weather passing through you. So when you say real, I take that as a good thing. But maybe if you saw me 5 minutes from now, I wouldn't seem so real. I don't know.
Well, I have a question. You're both teachers of writing. So basically every day you're forming, creative minds, critical thinkers. In your own work, because it is about your life, how critical are you of your writing, and how do you work through that?
I'm incredibly critical of my own writing. In fact, I think it gets harder and harder, and I'm more and more critical of it the more that I know. In terms of working through it, it's a kind of ongoing battle to sit down and do the work, to sit down and no matter what, and kind of establish a routine or a ritual where pretty much no matter how I'm feeling about what a terrible writer I am and how nothing will ever happen again and I will never have another idea in my head, and all of the things that my inner censor voice can kind of really work up a great head of steam. Or as Annie Lamott said, I think it's, I wouldn't want to be like, my mind isn't a neighborhood I want to live in. If I continue to sit down and not allow all of those, the resistance, the impatience, just the self-censorship, even self-loathing, to kind of get in the way, as long as I sit down, I will be able to get my work done that day. And I try to think of it as really none of my business as I'm writing a first draft. And then eventually needing to put on another hat, a much more critical hat, and explore it in that way.
Maybe I should be more critical of my work, I'm not sure. I do this thing now, when I teach now, I actually, I think the thing is, the first drafts, I don't see really a need to be critical at all, actually. I just write crazy, terrible things in my first drafts. And, the first drafts of Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, people said, some reviewers said, oh, it's remarkably free of self-pity. And if they saw the drafts, they would just be dripping with self-pity. But I read them over, and self-pity just it's not very good writing, so it comes out, so that's the only thing that buoyed me, was that it took me, 7 years to write it. And so in that time, I edited things. And I actually didn't mind editing because I could sort of look at it and be like, I wrote that? Like, that's really bad. Like, or I didn't even, it seems like another person writes it. It does seem like someone else writes it. So I don't mind going back in and doing it. And one thing I do for the free writing now, too, for the initial writing, I've been just doing this meditation thing beforehand, where I make all my students do it now, too. It's almost like I'm sort of like a cult leader or something. And I don't even tell them how to meditate. I just sort of say, okay, we're going to meditate now, and I just sort of start the timer, and they're like, what? And they look around, and we meditate, and then we write from it. And I just think it like really helps to get rid of that conscious mind stuff and all the critical stuff, and like, they're just they're just feeling bad because they don't know how to meditate, So, and then they just write. They write good stuff. So.
It's funny, I do that too. I didn't know you did that.
Make them meditate?
I make them meditate.
I know. It's so great now.
Yeah.
Like you can just tell people to meditate. They don't even say like, I don't know how to meditate. What's that?
Right. No.
Everyone sort of knows or wants to know how to meditate.
Well, and it also breaks through the whole idea that like I'm a bad meditator because I can't, because they sit there for however many minutes, one way or another. Yeah. But there's also, I had the realization recently that there's, and it's also because I teach in different formats. I teach in like large groups where I'm not reading their work, and then in academic settings or in much more advanced settings. And I realized there's writing that's about getting it down, and then there's writing that's about getting it right. And if you sit there before you get it down and worry about getting it right, nothing's going to be down on the page. And until something's down on the page, there's nothing to shape, there's nothing to think about, there's just nothing.
Yeah, and the great pleasure is shaping it, I think, and even playing with syntax and grammar and all those things that are sort of horrifying, but that's sort of the tools we have, and it's actually, I find it fun now, so, yeah.
There's a question I want. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi.
Could you do it in a sort of a verse form, a spoken verse form?
I don't know.
Thank you for last night, by the way. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you came.
It was really good.
Thanks for this. This has been amazing.
Yeah.
So my question is, writing, right, is sort of where the subconscious and conscious mind merges and weaves and meets, right? And there's a dream sequence, and you guys, when you write, especially when, Dani, when you're talking about the typewriter, it's sort of like a prayer. It's like the shaman with the drum. And I guess the question I have for you guys is, like, through that process, like, how does the thing chase you? And, like, how do your actual dreams, the imprints of your actual dreams, like, do you dream of your parents? Do they say certain things? Are you still actively, even outside of the tool, the drum, the computer, the typewriter, the pen, how is that dream sequence moving through you? And how do you capture it when it kind of runs in your face? And, is it difficult to even, like, can you be in a room sometimes and be writing mentally? Or, I guess that's sort of what I'm trying to ask. You know what I mean?
The capturing, like, I don't think of capturing it. I think of sort of trying to, like it's a little thread that I'm trying to follow into, like, some unknown realm. And often it'll come in a bit of language or an image or just a scene that sort of just keeps coming back to me in my writing, and it connects to something sort of in some deeper realm. And I just try to sort of follow that and honor it. David Mamet says that the conscious mind cannot create art. That it really is getting out of your conscious mind, which is why I try to meditate, try to write faster than I can think, why I try to write from dreams and try to honor those. And Lewis Hyde in that great book, The Gift, talks about D.H. Lawrence, just sort of saying that it's not, not I, but the wind that blows through me. Like, it's not really, in a certain sense, when you're really sort of in the midst of it, it doesn't feel like it's you writing or it's really about you. It's really just sort of, it's just sort of flowing through you, the writing. You just sort of honor that and just sort of ride it, and it doesn't last very long often. Often it lasts like in a writing period. Like, that's a real gift when it does come, when suddenly those moments come. And I think, it sounds like from what I've heard of you definitely capture that in your work also. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that it's unmistakable when it happens, right? Like, it's not like, did that just happen? It's very, very clear, that feeling of this is something, there's juice here, or there's, Joan Didion uses the word shimmer to describe it, which I love. It has the shimmer around the edges of it. But for me, it's actually different when I'm writing fiction or nonfiction. When I'm writing fiction, when I'm in the middle of a novel, I much more have the feeling that there is actually an entire parallel universe, that I'm walking around in my world, but I can also just kind of take a little step to the side, and sliding doors wise, I'm now in that world. Or an example of this is my in-laws live in Andover, Massachusetts, and I created a fictional town in my novel Family History that is Andover, Massachusetts. It's not called Andover. And ever since I wrote that novel, that came out in 2003, so it's more than 10 years ago, when I visit Andover, I feel like I'm walking into my novel. Because that world became that real to me. Whereas with memoir, it feels different. It doesn't feel like there's this other world that I can sidestep into. It feels more like there's this place inside of me that expands and I can dive into it. And when I can, when it opens up and allows me to do it, there's a lot there. And then I can kind of shoot back up out of it and join the land of the living.
You have time for one more question, and down front here.
Thank you. Did either of you keep journals when you were growing up, or is this sense of memoir totally from your imagination? Or not imagination, but your memory of what was going on? Or were you working from journals?
Are there notes that we can go back to and look at?
Yeah.
I did some research. I do research, but I usually hold off on research with this kind of writing until I can't bear it anymore. Like, I would never sort of say like, oh, did we live on that street in 1971? Like, is that, let's Google it and see if that house is still there. Like, I think that would ruin my memory of it, because then I would then see a picture of it and then I'd be, oh, no, that wasn't the house. And so I actually spend a lot of time writing from my misremembered past. And I think that's actually much more interesting usually for this kind of writing, is how you misremember things and how you create whole worlds, and then you go talk to your brother and say, did we live there? And he says, no, we didn't live there. We lived over at that other place. And then so you put that in the book too. You put like, my brother says I lived over there. And then eventually maybe you go to the house and you see the house like, oh, this doesn't look anything like I remember it, or it's much smaller than I remember, or whatever. And then you write that about it. Then maybe you research the house a little bit or something and find some documents about it, or a letter that your mother wrote or something. But if you did all that stuff first, it would sort of cut off the internal memory, which is really the main juice of this kind of work. It's very different than straight nonfiction. This is creative nonfiction. And so it's a very different project. I'm not writing a biography of that house, of my life. I'm really trying to sort of capture the experience of consciousness, and what it was and what we remember and how, and then to question that experience in the writing, through the writing, and say like, wow, I remembered it this way, but I didn't remember it that way, but it actually happened this way, seemingly. So that's what's interesting to me. So I don't have any notes from my childhood. I wasn't a very prolific writer as a child. I got a diary every year, and I wrote for like 2 days in it. And it was very boring, so.
I love the idea of misremembering as being part of the narrative itself, because what the writer is really doing is attempting to hew to memory, not jumping off into the world of imagination, but like memory is it's a whole different animal. And I had a really different experience because I kept copious journals when I was a girl and when I was a young woman. And when I started writing Slow Motion, my first memoir, I was about a chapter into it, and I had been invited to go to Yaddo, which is an artist colony, where they feed you, and you have a very nice room, and you're around other writers, and you have just time to work and think. And I got there, and I set up in my room, and it was a beautiful room with like windows overlooking the grounds, and there was a fainting couch in the middle of the room. And I was told that Carson McCullers had written there, which was not intimidating at all. And I brought all of my journals with me. I brought boxes and boxes of typewritten pages, cloth-bound journals, just everything that I could get my hands on. I even had to break into an old filing cabinet to get the journals out, and I had to bring them with me. And so the first day I was there, after breakfast, I went up to my room with the intention of reading through all of the journals before I went back to work. And all I know is that the next thing I knew, it was like 4 hours later, and I was on the fainting couch, and I had passed out. And I was very depressed. I woke up feeling like I don't have a book. I can't write this book. Because the voice in those journals had nothing to do with the book that I wanted to write. And in fact, the voice in those journals didn't deserve a book. I was like, you do not deserve a book, you callow young woman who didn't have a thought in her head. What were you doing? What were you thinking? You're pathetic. And I packed up the journals and I put them back in the box and I went back to work. And that doesn't mean that I didn't find other ways of making sure that certain aspects of what I was writing were accurate, or at least examining my own sort of questions of what I remember and what I don't remember, which I find really interesting to do on the page. But I knew that that young woman with the loopy handwriting was not going to help me.
All right, well, thank you guys, both of you, for sharing all of that. And of course, the nice people from the Expedition Bookshop have carried all these books over here, and it would be really cruel to make them carry them back. So if you buy them, Dani and Nick would be happy to sign them to you or to your niece or whomever you would like to give them to. All right, thanks.